Morena, good afternoon.
Yeah, right.
Okay, we're just going to admit everybody first. Let's give them a few couple of minutes to do that, but we will get started as soon as everybody is in. So how have you all been? It's already the second week of your course, second day of your second week. Time flies. And it's going to be an exciting, I think some of you mentioned this during your the first session, that you are very interested to know about more about the China. So you'll definitely be hearing a lot of that today with both of your sessions. Okay, so just admit the rest of your colleagues who are joining still. And then now I'm just opening with the character and we'll get started. Tutawa mai irunga, tutawa mai iraro, tutawa mai iwaho, tutawa mai iroto. Kia tawai, te maritu, te mariora, ki te katua, humye, huye, taikie. Okay, so without further ado, because we have a lot to cover today, I will hand you over immediately to your first lecturer for this morning or afternoon in your part of the world to discuss China's economy and trade. He's from the University of Auckland Business School. I hand you over to your first speaker for today, Dr. Haiping Zhang. Over to you, Haiping.
Yeah, thank you again. This is Haiping. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you guys. And I am Haiping Zhang. I'm currently serving as the co-director for APAC Study Center in New Zealand in University of Auckland Business School. Today, I would like to give you a quick snapshot about a few aspects of Chinese economy. And during the session, I will really recommend you to raise questions, or if you have anything you want me to talk a little bit more about that, please feel free to pop up your message through the chat function. If I have time, probably I will also monitor the chat box. But anyway, without further ado, let me show you the first picture of my slides. So before we go on with China's current economic situation, I would like to give you a first overview about China's position in world economy as of in the new millennium since 2000. In the last 25 years, you can see clearly Chinese economy has been growing, and its importance in the global economy has been rising. So the China's GDP as a share of the world GDP has increased from less than 5% to nearly 17%, 18% within 25 years. And then if you look at China's manufacturing value added, it is even higher. So in 2004, so China's manufacturing output account for less than 10% of the global manufacturing output, while in 2023, it exceeded 30% of world manufacturing output. So that's people argue that China has become the world factory, producing a lot of manufacturing goods as export to the rest of the world. And in the meantime, you can see clearly the G7, the seven major industrial countries, that the share of the GDP and the manufacturing value added has been declining from nearly 65%, two-thirds of the world, to around 45%. That's GDP, while manufacturing value added, or basically industrial output of G7 country have fell from slightly over 60% to nearly 30%. So this is a very important big picture about what's going on with China's rise in the last 2.5 decades. Well, you can also see the US. Actually, US share of the world GDP didn't change very much. It started at around 30%, and even after 2.5 decades, it still maintained 25% of the world GDP. And if you look at US manufacturing value added, it has been accounted for almost a quarter of the world industrial output at the beginning of this century, while in the recent years, the latest number is 2023, it is fell around 16%. So its world share has fell by 10 percentage point. Many people argue that it's U.S. industrial output, U.S. manufacturing sector is declining. But if you really look at the numbers, you should count by the labor productivity rather than by the manufacturing output. Even though the U.S. manufacturing output has been declining, but if you look at labor productivity, you will see clearly that in China, the manufacturing sector hire roughly 112 million people, basically manufacturing workers. And if you look at the US, US only hired 12.8 million workers. So roughly one ninth of China's manufacturing workers. If you look at their output shares, so US production manufacturing output is half of China's manufacturing output, but they only hire one ninth of the workers. So if you look at labor productivity in the US, it's 4.5 times as much as in China. So US manufacturing is not declining. US manufacturing is just become more productive. Labor become more productive. So this is a very important fact. So if you look at recent discussion about President Trump's view about bring job back to the US, that is not really a very well grounded argument because U.S. manufacturing workers are now specialized in high-end manufacturing, high value added. But if they want to bring manufacturing job or low-end, low value added job back to the U.S., that will dilute U.S. competitiveness in the world market. So this is one of the observations I would like to share with you first. And second, if you look at China's export share of the world export, you can see clearly merchandise export means that the export of all goods, including the agricultural produce, manufacturing goods, resources, commodities. China's export of merchandise has rise from around 4% at the beginning of this millennium to around 15% of the world goods exports. But if you look at manufacturing export, China's manufacturing export has surpassed roughly 20% in the recent years. However, this is only goods. But if you look at services export, China is far behind this curve. China's services export only around 5%, slightly over 5%. But that is far below its global share of goods. So that's why in the recent years, if you look at many of the Chinese government documents, government tried to enforce or increases their services exports. But if you look at U.S., it's just opposite. The U.S. manufacturing or merchandise export has been declining, but U.S. services trade is dominating around 15% of the world share, 3 times as much as China's services exports. So this is a big difference. So US already specialize in high-end, high value-added activities, including high-end manufacturing, including high-end, high value-added services, including the Hollywood movies, financial services, high-tech services, patents, softwares. These are all high value-added. So US manufacturing is not declining. US manufacturing is going up and up, right? So this is a big picture I would like to share with you before we move on to the current economic situation in China. So if you look at the recent news, you could probably get puzzled or get confused. On one side, you can see a lot of mainstream mediums. They talk about very negative or very pessimistic view about Chinese economy, including the retail sales didn't work, disappointed, even though the government put a lot of effort, stimulus effort to boost up domestic consumption, but the retail sales didn't look very optimistic, and the consumption actually slide during this recent months about in the last 2 months about U.S. tariff war, and China factory gate basically the price of the product that get out of the factory, the price index is going down rather than going up. It basically means that you cannot sell to the U.S. market. You have to find elsewhere to sell the product, which you have to sell at the lower price. So this is not very optimistic for Chinese economy, and home prices continue to slide. It's not, you don't see that a house price is going up, actually goes slightly slowing down, even going down. And the government actually tried to roll out a lot of employment support, tried to offset the tariff hike of the US on China's manufacturing or export sectors. And even worse, that China's fiscal revenue actually fell. So if you look at the GDP numbers, you will see Chinese GDP number has been growing at the 4%, 5% official statistics. But if you look at the fiscal revenue, which is a very effective signal about economic growth. If the economy is doing well, the tax revenue or tax revenue of the government should increase, right? But it didn't increase, actually slightly for us going down a little bit. This also signalizes a challenge that Chinese economy is currently facing. However, if you look at other side of the picture, you will see another completely different story. So people talk about Chinese economy despite the U.S. tariff, Chinese export is still resilient, growing, and also investment is continually maintaining a strong footing. And China stimulus actually support industrial profit, even though it didn't create boost up consumption so much, but it increases industrial profit. And one additional positive news is that Chinese energy has been switching to the clean energy or renewable energy that makes Chinese CO2 emission going down. So CO2 emission going down could be for two reasons. The first reason is because what? You use better cleaner energy, that you reduce your CO2 emission, or your economy is slowing down, right? But actually, in China, the last quarter, the CO2 energy demand is actually increasing, but CO2 emission actually decreases. It basically signals that China has make a great progress in the clean energy deployment. Another one is about EV cars. So EV cars continue maintain their strong foothold in European markets. Basically, it's also part of the export growth. And also, despite U.S. Sanction on China's chip industry, so Huawei are basically major semiconductor R&D companies or semiconductor high-tech companies. They actually create a new AI chip. So they try to break the sanction from the US. And also China tried to be more open to the rest of the world. They extend visa-free policy, 30 days visa-free policy for the citizens from Latin American countries, five Latin American countries. Up to this month, China has been granted 47 countries in the world 30-day visa-free travel. So this signals that China tried to become more and more open to the rest of the world instead of become more protectionist. So this, in the following, I would like to give you a big picture about how to reconcile these opposing facts. So optimistic and pessimistic is very different views, but coexist in the mainstream news, mainstream media. So I would like to start first about the real estate sector, which is obviously, if you are familiar with China's economy, so obviously you cannot avoid this topic, the real estate sector contraction, put in the moderate word, or collapsing in someone's views. So where should we start? Actually, we should start from the last decade. So if you look at Chinese real estate market or housing market, it was a booming decade. So this is the price new residential new house price index by city tiers. For the first tier cities, usually refer to the top four cities in China: Peking, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. This is the top four metropolitan area. And if you consider top tier, also include other capital city of the provinces. So this is called first tier cities. So in the last decade, you can see the house price has been increasing regularly above nearly 20% or above 20% per year. This is striking, right? It's unbelievable. And if you look at even for second tier cities, like this one, second tier cities, including major city, not the capital city of the major provinces, but the growth rate of their house price is already 15%, more than 15% per year. So this is crazy, right? So if you are the real estate developers, if you see the house price like this, what are you going to do? You definitely want to buy more land, build more houses, and sell at a higher price, right? So if this is the case, this is exactly what happened in China. You can see that from 2015, when this house price, the latest wave of house price boom started, and then you can see clearly the property sales and property starts are both increasing, very much following the pattern of prices. However, it is the pandemic actually make a first hit around early 2000. However, China quickly recovered from pandemic within a few months, and the real estate market started to continue to develop. And you can see that the property sales and property starts continue to rise even after the pandemic. However, there are something changes. Around middle of 2020, the house property sales and property start both collapse. And more strikingly, the local government revenue from land sales followed pretty much the same wave, but collapsed substantially. This is create a huge damage for the local government revenue. So you see that in 1994, China made a first or major reform in the fiscal revenue between the central government and local governments. So most of the tax revenue goes to the central government. How could local government still survive? So government offered local government an option to sell land. If you develop the economy very well, you can sell land to the real estate developers, and you get the land sale revenue to supplement your local revenue, local fiscal revenue for local development. Now, of course, local government depend heavily on the land sales. The revenue used for local infrastructure. So this one actually collapsed substantially. So it's not a small number, a small decrease. It's almost 50% decrease of land sales from over 10 trillion Chinese yuan, from over 9 trillion Chinese yuan to only slightly above 5 trillion Chinese yuan within 2 years. So how this happened, or why these things happened at around this time point? So you see that if you are Chinese government, you probably, when you look at the house price boom like this, you probably a little bit more worried, because we already see many countries in the region, in China, in Asia, in other East Asia region, including Southeast Asia, including Japan, including Taiwan, including Japan. So many of the economies in the region, you will see the house price boom and bust. You probably heard about Japan's lost decades, right? It's all starting 1990s when the house price collapsed, and the entire Japan economy was stand still for almost 2 or 3 decades. So the Chinese government was very, very worried about the house price spike. So since 2016, Chinese government already make moral persuasion. They say that house or property is to be lived in, not to be speculated on. But if you are usual Chinese citizens or Chinese resident living in the large cities, the major cities, of course, you won't listen to government moral persuasion. You will follow the market signals. When the price is going up, you buy houses. You try to leverage upon your mortgage loans and try to get new houses, and that will offer you 20% capital gains per year. So of course, many people buy land, buy house, and the house price even higher. So this one basically says that moral persuasion in 2016 at the peak of the house price boom didn't work very well. And the pandemic makes everything change everything. Even though the Chinese economy quickly get out of the pandemic within a few months, but Chinese government realized that the low interest rate started with United States, flooded the market with some huge amount of money, huge amount of liquidity. And many of these funds are flowing into the real estate sector in China, because Chinese real estate developers, their investment is heavily depend on external loans, external funds. So if you look at their debt to asset ratio in 2019, even before the pandemic, is around 80% or nearly 90%. What does this number mean? It means that basically if you invest $100 in your project, the real estate developer only take around $19 or $13 from their own pocket. The rest of the money coming from external sources. either from the stock market or either from the banks or from the financial market through corporate bonds. Thanks to the low interest rate in the last decades, so the Chinese real estate developers, they have very high leverage ratio. So that fueled this kind of real estate boom in China. However, things changed a little bit when the pandemic hit, when the house price growth slowed down, and then you will see clearly the non-performing loan ratio start to rise. Anticipating this kind of future interest rate hike in the United States, because you cannot have interest rate at zero forever, right? You can borrow interest rate at zero, almost close zero interest rate during the pandemic, but people know that is the interest rate will rise later on. Anticipating the interest rate hike in the future, the Chinese government actually implements 3 red lines in August 2020, very early, almost 2 years, 1.5 years before the U.S. interest rate hikes actually happened. What did they do? They actually imposed 3 requirements for the real estate developers. You need to make sure that your total liability cannot exceed 70% of assets. You basically force the real estate developer put at least 30% of own money into the project. So, and also sovereignty net debt cannot exceed equity, and cash reserve, basically short-term payment, has to be at least enough to cover the short-term debt, basically 33 months to 1 year debt. So, of course, many of the real estate developers, they cannot satisfy these 3 requirements at the same time, or 1 or 2 requirements. So they have to fulfill this requirement by what? By sell the land they already purchased from the government to the third party to get the money back and then to fulfill these requirements. Of course, it is not easy. So you will see banks also try to retract their liquidity from the market. They try to lend less to the market because, of course, the banks are in China are heavily influenced by the government moral persuasion in some way. And what is consequence is a substantial liquidity crisis. In 2023, just 2 years or 3 years later, the sales of China's top 100 developers fell by nearly 30% from a year ago. And the largest developer, Country Gardens, sales fell by 81%. You see how powerful this policy was, right? And 1 month later, Country Garden cannot repay their external debt, external bonds on the U.S. market. And that was so only 50 million US dollar bonds is not a big deal, right? But of course, that triggers a cross default of 11 billions of offshore bonds because everyone gets scared about the Chinese real estate developers. They try to sell, and then the bond price collapse forced the developer further to liquidate their assets, and then that create the snowball effect. And a few months later, as you probably all heard about that, Evergrande, one of the largest China's developer, was ordered to liquidate, basically bankrupt. So of course, with this kind of 3 red lines, actually causes substantial decline of real estate sector in entire China. I mean, even the house price today is far below its peak a few years ago. And of course, what if you look at the housing real estate sector? Real estate sector in China has a huge downstream or upstream connection with different sectors, like the construction sectors, like the house appliance sectors, the white house appliance like refrigerator, air conditioner, all these kind of electronic sectors are heavily connected with housing market, right? If people stop buying houses, then they will have lower demand for these new household appliances. This is very important, right? So of course, if you look at manufacturing purchasing manager index, you will see that 50/50 is a what we call neutral. If the index number is above 50, then basically it's a business expansion. If it's below 50, it is contraction. You wouldn't call that recession, but contraction, economic contraction. You see that during this after 2021, you see most of the time this index is below 50, and in some months it's very low. It basically say Chinese economy didn't look very good. And if you look at the other side, you'll see that.
Ela também deu uma napolitana que eu demorei muito para entender que realmente era uma napolitana. Você entendeu hoje às 5 horas da tarde, só que ela falou 7 horas da noite. Aqui, processo é lento.
All right. So if you look at this is basically about production. How about consumption? So there's also index called Consumer Confidence Index that reports consumers' sentiment about the market, about their willingness to spend. Yes, Olivia, I saw that you have a hand up.
Yes, no, I was just going to ask what can explain this in the other graph when we are talking about manufacturing PMI, like because there is this huge, just a little bit after January. What explained this
You mean this
expansion that it
one?
went above 50? Yes.
So this is basically because the contraction, substantial contraction here, and there is kind of incidents during this period. I think you probably heard about there is a kind of China has a called zero COVID policy. It was much longer than many other countries in the world. And in 2022, New Zealand already opened international travel. Of course, in New Zealand, we have a very strict COVID policy, but middle of 2022, people can free travel, right? Because we all had the best vaccine. However, China has still maintained zero COVID policy, especially during, if you see that the Shanghai lockdown in early 2022 had substantially caused the damage the economy substantially. And this policy was implemented until almost the end of 2022, especially to the November 2022, and suddenly Chinese government had a U-turn. They completely abolished the zero COVID policy, like free travel. And of course, people say, "Oh, that's good news. Let's do business," because it basically says that China's changed their policy stance. And of course, people become very optimistic about this policy, and they try to say, "Oh, we are back to normal." Of course, it's just last a few months and then collapsed again. So this is basically the thing. I mean, if you look a little bit about news report, there was very intense discussion about why these things happened in China. But anyway, let's look at this is the production side, business. This is all about consumers. If you look at consumer confidence, of course, during COVID lockdown in Shanghai, it's a very dramatic move. Basically, consumer confidence collapsed from 120, which is basically says that very optimistic, to below 90, very pessimistic. And then since then, this one has been remain below 100 for for almost 2 years, more than 2 years. And if you look at this line basically shows the new home average price and existing or old home existing average price. So before the COVID lockdown in Shanghai, this price indices has been around pretty okay, because after COVID, because China has quickly get out of COVID, even though there was a short-term decline, but then recovered. However, the COVID lockdown in Shanghai in early 2022 actually changed the entire picture. And therefore, if you look at China, the private ownership of housing is the largest form of China's household wealth, around 70%. In other words, if you have entire household wealth of $1 million, so $700,000 locked in your house. If your house value go down, how about your household wealth go down, right? Basically, if you feel poor, you don't want to spend. So this is basically signalize that housing market price movement has a very important wealth effect on consumers' consumption behavior. Right. So far, I have given you a big picture about the one of the major reasons about Chinese economic slowdown in the recent years, partially because of COVID, partially because of the real estate sector contraction. Right. Now, this is a relatively pessimistic view. However, if you look at another side of the picture, as I mentioned in the news articles, people now talk about China Shock 2.0 and the new economy in China. What exactly China Shock 2.0? So if you have followed the economic trade literature, you probably heard about China Shock. Basically, it's referred to the article published by MIT professor and his colleagues talking about China's export of labor-intensive manufacturing goods like shoes, furniture, clothing, footwear to the Western economy like European Union and the United States has caused substantial loss of manufacturing jobs. That is the narrative of that articles, and very influential article, economic article with very detailed evidence. They talk about this China shock to the rest of the world in terms of manufacturing employment. And in early last year, so early 2024, people actually talk about China shock 2.0. This time it's not anymore about the old three exports, clothing, home appliances, or furniture. This is what it called O3, the three major components of Chinese exports. And there are new three called electric vehicles, solar panel, rechargeable batteries, which are the components that are quickly rise in the last few years, especially after pandemic. So this is called new trial or new three. So if you look at this picture, you can see clearly there is a structural change in China's export components. And these products are usually referring to high tech, high value added, with high profit margin in some way, right? So this is a picture basically based on these facts. Some people argue that this time when you talk about China shock, it's not anymore China export will affect low-end manufacturing jobs in the US, in the European Union. As Chinese exports start to compete head-to-head with the high value or at least high-tech product or high-value added products in the European Union and in the United States. So it's a different type of competition. So in the first 2 decades after this millennium, in the first 2 decades, from 2000 to 2020, you will see that China shock mainly referred to Chinese export of low-end manufacturing compete or replace low-end jobs in the US, in the European Union. But as I mentioned before, US manufacturing is not declining. US manufacturing is going up to the high-end manufacturing. However, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, you will see that Chinese exports start to grow up to compete head-to-head with high-end manufacturing with US. This is the reason why people see this China shock 2.0. So upgraded or another version of China shock. Now, I took this picture from the recommended ratings that I shared with you on Canvas. So according to a recent RAND report, RAND articles, our article posted on RAND website, the author actually highlight a few key facts. The China share of global export by components in 2023. This is the latest data available. China actually account roughly slightly below 10%, or slightly below 15% of world goods exports. However, if you look at a few components, the new three, solar panel, China accounts for roughly 60% of global exports. And lithium-ion battery, basically rechargeable battery, China accounts for over 50% of the world total exports. And EV, China accounts for slightly over 20%. This is a dramatic change in terms of China's export components. And this is only the facts that we observe on trade sphere. If you look at fundamentally in Chinese economy, you will see a bigger picture. Trade, the change of export components in China is just an outcome of China's internal economy. If you look, this chart shows you the GDP growth rate in China as well as sectoral output growth rate of a few components. This black curve shows the China's real GDP growth rate. So it's pretty much like 5%. However, if you see that China's IT services as well as high-tech manufacturing is far above China's GDP growth rate. Basically means that Chinese economy has an internal upgrading in terms of manufacturing, in terms of high-tech products. And if you look at the average annual growth rate of sectoral investment in the last 5 years, from 2019 to 2024, average annual change of investment. For the entire manufacturing, average investment growth rate is around 7%, pretty normal, very much in line with GDP growth rate, right? If you look at other separate sectors, you see that electronic equipment or machinery, the investment growth rate is twice as much as the economy-wide average investment. Computer electronics, scientific research, polytechnics, aerospace and rail, probably heard about the high-speed rail, right? So these, what we call new economy, high value added, high tech, high end, high profit margin subsectors that witness a substantially higher investment than the average investment in the economy. By looking at the not aggregate number, but look at the sectoral level numbers in terms of growth rate, in terms of investment, you will see clearly Chinese economy has witnessed a kind of internal compositional change of their industrials. And what are behind these things? You probably heard about China has a kind of techno-industrial policy. This is not a general industrial policy we heard in the international media. This is a techno-industrial policy. This industrial policies is focused particularly on high-tech sectors. So industrial policy is not a new thing. It just gained popularity in the recent international media in the last 2 years. However, industrial policy has been used by many countries in history. In the US, you probably heard about Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary in 200 years ago. He already advocated for industrial policy to support so-called promising industry in the US through protectionism to grow their domestic industry, right? This is called kind of industrial policy through high tariff. And in East Asia economy, including Japan, South Korea, they all use industrial policy to boost up their shipbuilding industry, to build up their semiconductor industry, to build up their automobile industry in the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s. So in Southeast Asia, industrial policy has been used by several countries sequentially in the past decades after World War II. And China, this time, China's industrial policy is not about all industries, but about selected industries. So what are these industries? If you look at policy documents published in 2015, almost 10 years ago, you probably heard about this Made in China 2025. If you look at the international media around 2016, 2017, you will probably notice that this plan has caused significant concern from US, from European Union. So this policy documents is parallel to China's regular 5-year plan. You probably heard about China 5-year. Every 5 year, the government have a 5-year plan. And this 2025 is the end of the 14th 5-year plan in China. And next year will be start the 15th 5-year plan. So this 5-year plan is regular, cover every sessions of the Congress. However, on top of the 5-year plan, there is a 10-year plan. Like Made in China 2025 was announced 10 years ago. They designed a plan for the next 10 years. And what does this Made in China 2025 covers? The plan designed to boost China's competitiveness in the global manufacturing value chain. It's not anymore about low-ended, labor-intensive manufacturing. It starts to grow up. This industrial policy will not support shoe industry, will not support furniture industry, will not support a household appliance industry. They will focus on a few industries that emphasizing emerging technologies. It's not a mature technology, it's emerging new technologies. And the purpose is to leapfrog into new technology that hasn't been global industrial leaders like EV, for example. And also China try to use this kind of policy plan to boost up its indigenous innovation. This is a very sensitive word today. Because 10, 15 years ago, China was part of the global trading system. China had joined WTO in 2001, right? And quickly integrated into the world economy and leverage heavily upon FDI, leverage heavily upon foreign technologies, right? It helped China to grow up quickly. And in 2015, China started to promote, to emphasize the indigenous innovation, try to be self-sufficient in key industries, key technologies. This is very new. I just want to emphasize that because it has become nowadays very popular in many advanced economies like European Union, like United States. They try to have their own EV industries. They try to emphasize their own chip industries. However, the story wasn't look like this just 15 or 20 years ago. 20 years ago, when or basically in 2007, when Steve Jobs showed off his first iPhone at the Macworld conference, this iPhone was actually initially built in China. I have to say it's assembled in China, not built in China. Because the famous story about iPhone is that iPhone is designed in California, sourced from Japan, Korea, Germany, Netherlands, and shipped all these kind of components to China for assembly. So that's why we call assembled in China, designed in California, but assembled in China. So the last since 2000s, when we enter into the global economy, we are looking at a very well integrated global supply chain. So you cannot rely on a single country to do everything. So that's why China has been leveraged upon this foreign innovation, foreign technology substantially. However, 10 years ago, China already realized that this is a so-called indigenous innovation is crucial. And then they try to use this plan to promote indigenous innovation. And a few years later, I mean, 3 years later, China push up even higher level. It's not anymore about technology. It's about standard. China launched another 15-year plan called China Standard, try to set global standard for emerging technology like 5G, like Internet of Things, and AI even at that time. And 2 years ago, China launched another long-term vision about new quality productivity force. It sounds a little bit hard to understand what exactly it is. But if you look into the documents, it's just another version or higher version or high-end version of Made in China 2025. It become more specific in terms of many of the things we didn't even heard about this quantum computing, all this kind of high-end stuff. But if you look at these things, when China do things, they are not doing on an annual basis. They are not even doing that by 5-year plan basis. They are doing that usually by 10-year or 15-year or 20-year time frames. And how about the outcome? So because this year is the end of this plan, the Mark Rubio, who is currently the Secretary of State of the United States, he was senator last year. He published a very famous report, talk about he actually reviewed the Made in China 2025. How many sectors were successful, how many sectors was not, how many sectors still need improvement. He actually find out as of last year, China has achieved the goals 4 of the 10 sectors it targeted. The Made in 2025 listed 10 key sectors that China to aim to improve or to upgrade. And 4 of the sectors, according to Rubio's report, China has already achieved the goals, including EV, energy power, high-speed rail, shipbuildings. So these sectors, China has already hit their goal. There are a few numbers. I think you can read that. It's clear that China has been acquired a dominant position in the global market as well as domestic technology target. While China still has another 5 sectors need to some improvements, and the only sector China didn't achieve this goal is agricultural machineries. However, that was last year. So U.S. Chamber of Commerce just published a review of Made in China 2025 last month. I do recommend you to Google this U.S. Chamber of Commerce, look at their recent report on Made in China 2025. So you will see clearly what kind of goals China has achieved. But overall, this plan worked quite well. but I have to say it's quite expensive. It's not, according to the market standard, it's not efficient in many dimensions. But of course, if the policy is not for the efficiency, but for the self-sufficient, then I think this plan sounds quite successful in some dimension. Now, I would like to share with you one case study about China's clean energy deployment. So this is this chart shows you China's CO2 emission from 2017 to early this year. So we see that China's CO2 emission has been on upward trend in the last we say 8 years. In 2020, September 2020, China announces its plan for CO2 peaking around 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. That is China 30-60 goal, basic carbon goals, two double goals. And that was the date that China announced its plan. Of course, China's carbon emission continued to rise by 10% in the last since its announcement. Right. However, interestingly, people find out that since March 2024, since almost 14 months ago, carbon emission in China didn't increase anymore. It started to decline slightly by 1%. But anyway, it didn't follow the previous path of upward sloping, right? So if you look at the falling CO2 emission in the first 3 months of this year in comparison to January to March 2024, is partially because of, or mainly because of power industry. In power industry, it has the power CO2 emission substantial decline in comparison with other sectors. Other sectors still have CO2 emission increases. For example, chemical industries, metallurgical industries still increasing. However, the power industry, the CO2 emission has decreased substantially by 5%. So how could China manage to do this? So essentially, you will see clearly power industry is the major industry contribute to the CO2 reduction. So if you look at China energy growth in the past 2 decades, you will see clearly that most of the time, especially in the last since 2000, I would say 2015, China's power generation through the clean energy start to pick up, especially from 2015 onwards, almost 10 years ago, very much in line with Made in China 2025 plan. Since 2015 onwards, you will see that clean energy power capacity increase has been most of the time start to dominate the fossil fuel capacity growth. So regarding to this you can see most of the months is China's clean energy capacity increase start to rise. And the first quarter of this year, for the first time, China's clean energy growth exceed electricity demand growth. In other words, Chinese economy carbon emission declines not because the demand for energy declines. Actually, demand for electricity increases, but still the carbon emission decreases. So it's mainly because of clean energy growth, clean energy capacity growth dominate. Now, this is the standard solar farm in China, very small solar farm in China. And if you look at China, each of the dots represents a solar farm, scale size solar power installations across China. And the size of the size of this circle represents the capacity. So you see that I would like to introduce a line that is very, very popular, very famous in China. It's called Hu Huan Yong line. This line is a line identified by a very famous geographer in China in 1935. By looking at this line, you will see that according to his calculation, in 1935, almost 90 years ago, 96% of Chinese population at that time lived to the right of this line, this coastal area. At that time, 36% of China's land was to the right of this line. So in other words, Chinese population is highly concentrated on the coastal area. However, all the rest of the part is called inland or the rural area, the inland area, which has very low population density, mainly because of the geography, because of high mountains or many geographic obstacles that hinder the people living condition over there. Surprisingly, in 2010, you will see, according to the China's population census, exactly the same line. To the right of this same line, 94% of population live to the right of this to the line, and 47% of land to the right of this whole line. So of course, you probably heard about Mongolia became independent after a Yalta conference in 1945. Therefore, it changes the population land proportion of the territory to the right of this line. But anyway, still the same. This is a magical line that shows the population density in China. And now, if you look at the regional development, economic development, also coast areas, the highly developed area, and inland was far lagging behind the curve of economic development. However, things has changed, especially after the last decade. You will see many of these solar panel solar farms were installed not only to this place, but mainly to the rest. And this is basically this traditionally rural area, underdeveloped area or inland area become a popular place for installing this solar farm. And of course, taking into account of electricity generation and still most of the people living here, the demand for electricity are concentrated on the coastal area. How can you shift the electricity from the inland area where the electricity will generate from solar panel to the coastal area? And China has developed a ultra high voltage electricity transmission system that can transmit electricity through thousands of miles at a very low electricity loss. So this I want to share with you today because this could be relevant for many of the Latin American countries. When you have a large territory, but you could utilize some rural area where was considered as an economic underdeveloped area to install solar panel and generate electricity and supply using this ultra high voltage electricity transmission system, transmit electricity to the place where your high economic demand for electricity. China offer this kind of interesting solution package for installing the solar panel, not only for installing solar panel, but also how to transmit the electricity through 1,000 miles. Yes, Livia.
Sorry, me again. Two questions on energy. First, because if you know, like the percentage of like because in Brazil we have what we call like an integrated system. So basically, most of the Brazilian territory it's integrated, so you can ship electricity from one side to the other. So I would like to know like to what extent China is that integrated besides that they have this transmission. So if it's like more than 50%, it's reaching like, I don't know, 100%. And on the clean energy, you mentioned that the clean energy is increasing. If you would have the percentage that the clean energy is responsible in China's matrix, like roughly
I will show you
nowadays.
on the next slide. On the next slide. But thank you for the question because this is not only because solar panel or solar energy has a lot of features which is not appropriate for use as a fossil electricity. So one of these is because of the weather, right? In the day, during daytime, you could have solar electricity. However, in the night, you can't. So there is a high spikes and the valley of the electricity generated by solar farm. And not only the high voltage electricity transmission is important, but also the storage of solar electricity and utilization, how to put it into the grid, national grid. It's a very complicated things. And China actually in the last 10 years has developed a sophisticated system to monitor or predict how much electricity will be produced by the solar farm. They look at the weather, look at the cloud, look at all this kind of weather forecasting, integrated all the data through this management of electricity adjustment system. This is crucial. Not only you install the solar panel for your house, that's all fine. But if you want to use this kind of solar farm, because this electricity generated by the solar farm is not small, it's huge. And the spike is huge and down is very huge. That will create huge damage to the grid if it's not monitored very well. And of course, if you look at many of the new technology that through this industry, or solar industry, Chinese firms has developed a lot of techniques to utilize this electricity generated by solar farm more efficiently. Not only solar farm, you can also see the wind farm. So wind farm basically also you can see that many of the rural area, which was considered as underdeveloped area, now has been installed wind farm and generate electricity. And also through the ultra high voltage electricity transmission will supply electricity to the coastal area. And back to your question, in China has nearly half of the global solar wind power capacity. And if you look at the latest number, China's combined wind solar capacity has surpassed China's coal power capacity last year. So 50% electricity now generated by clean energy. And the rest of the 50% was generated by coal. And the first quarter of this year, solar, basic clean energy, solar and wind capacity has exceeded the thermal source, both the coal and the gas. So apparently 50% of the electricity generated by clean energy in China. And China's solar power operate under pricing mechanism dictated by market condition. Previously, the Chinese government offered the price guarantee for the solar electricity to the grid price. But this month, starting from this month, there's no more subsidy. You have to follow the contract for difference. What is contract for difference? So basically, the solar electricity providers, they will bid for the price. If the price is above the national grid price, then you have to pay to the grid, to the government. If the price is below the national grid price, the government will pay you. So it's very much like market driven. So the electricity, basically the national grid price will be the reference. If you're above, you pay the government. If you're below the price, the government pay you. So it's very much like market driven. It's not anymore subsidized like previously. That's why the timing is very important. Before this policy was introduced, before subsidy was abolished, there's all this kind of firms, this rushing to build. That's why the installation of solar capacity is spiked last year. Everyone tried to catch the last bus, right? And then as of June last year, China was home to almost 2/3 of the global solar and wind power under construction. And 1/3 of China planned solar and wind capacity was on construction. In other words, this is what China is currently is building, but China already announced another twice as much as what is currently doing. And global average was only 7%. People announced but didn't push forward very quickly. And why did China invest so heavily in this clean energy? So there are a few arguments. Of course, the first one is about China's energy security concerns. China is not an oil-rich country. They don't have so much fossil energy. They have to import oil from the Middle East, from other places in the world, also from US actually. And the second reason is because China make a commitment for the double carbon target, 30-60, right? 2030 carbon peak, 2060 carbon neutrality. Of course, they want to follow their political commitment. And more importantly, I have to say, China developed their strategic emerging industry that require heavily electricity. You probably heard, can you name a few critical industries that could depend heavily on electricity? Anyone of you could share with us what your thoughts? Which industry is now very popular but also require huge amount of electricity?
Data centers and artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. These are the new popular industries, right? If you look at Elon Musk, right? Many of these tech giants, they are actually devoting all in AI, right? Same thing in China. All these kind of new industries or AI or data centers, they are basically eat so much electricity, and their appetite for electricity is continue rising. In order to make sure that electricity is sufficient as a basic infrastructure for the next step of AI, Chinese government always planning ahead of the time, even though at a loss at the very beginning. But then when you put this infrastructure in place, then the industry will grow. If you don't have electricity, forget about data center. And this data center will consume a huge amount of electricity. And if you do not develop clean energy, you have to rely on fossil energy. If you do so, you will break your commitment for carbon reduction. So this is kind of dilemma, right? You want to hit different multiple targets at the same time. You have to think about what is the optimal solution. And clean energy deployment is one of the optimal solution China is planning. Now, let's talk about second thing about China digital infrastructure, because I said electricity is a fundamental infrastructure for many of the modern or cutting edge technologies. And one of the cutting edge technologies is AI or data center or digital sectors. China has been subject to the chip sanction by the US. And in order to partially offset this sanction, Chinese government tried to coordinate the computing power nationwide. Right? Think of yourself. If you buy a chip, you can install the chip only at your home, right? Use for yourself. But when you sleep, this chip is stay idle. And what Chinese government policy is that to coordinate the national computing power into a grid, into a network, so that everyone can use this kind of, everyone try to connect with the computer center through the cloud. And this way is basically government play important role to coordinate national computing power network. And very much like when I did my PhD almost 25 years ago, I used my personal hard drive to store my thesis, my data. But I only use that occasionally. But the hard drive I purchased that, right? Nowadays, I don't purchase a hard drive. I use Google Cloud. So essentially, everyone uses the cloud storage. So the server is used more efficiently than I buy the hard drive and put in my house. So this is the policy that Chinese government is trying to implement. It's called National Integrated Computing Power Network. So this one, they call the China Computing Net. It's an integrated grid of all of AI computing centers, data center clusters. They try to integrate everyone together. And as of last March, over 30 cities are actively building intelligent computing data centers specifically designed to run AI workloads. And in the future, people argue that in the future, when you are doing computing power, is very much like electricity. And this is the major plan by Chinese government about the future of digital infrastructure. It's called East Data, West Computing. Now I want to recall our new friend Hu Huanyong line, this line, right? So this line represents 94% of population economic activities are in this place. Of course, where are data generated? Data generated where people are, right? When you travel on the road, when you are actually booking the shopping online, when you are paying your cars at the supermarket, so the transaction will collect data. But where will be the data computed or doing algorithm and computed?
Department for me.
Yeah. So and when you are talking about this data generation, it's generated in the coastal area where it's very, very well developed. However, think of if you build a data center in the coastal area, first of all, it's very costly. Second, electricity is very costly. So what are you going to do? You build the thing in the west region. So it's called East Data, West Computing. So the data are collected from these major developed areas and transmitted to the west internal inland areas. They have a data center not here. They have data center all in the west rural areas. Remember what I just mentioned to you? Solar panel, solar farm, wind farm, where are they? The newly installed solar farm, wind farm are here because land is almost for free. You don't pay much for land, right? Anyway, if you don't come here, nobody use land. So land is almost for free. So you have all the solar farm here, wind farm here. They build a data center, not in the developed coastal area. They are built data center here, 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 where the electricity are. So you don't even need to send electricity to the coastal area. You just send data here, doing the computation here, and send results back to the east. That's called East Data, West Computing. This is a big grand plan by the government. You cannot do this by individual firms. It's a huge amount of infrastructure costs, right? So this is what I would like to share with you. It's very recent developments, I would say. So the two case study I share with you is about infrastructure. It's not about single business. It's not about individual Alibaba or WeChat or our individual business. No, it's about big infrastructure. So by the two case study, you probably see that the government is not intervening individual business, individual sectors. They are providing what? The infrastructure for the business to develop. So this is an interesting perspective that Chinese government have been using, talking about techno-industrial policy. Government does not intervene in individual firms, but they build the railroad, railway, high-speed railway, the basically ultra distance electricity transmission system to ship electricity from rural area to the coastal area. They build data center, shared data center network to facilitate the growth of AI. So we'll see clearly in the future, this will be the bedrock for the development of new industries. Now, given the time constraint, I will give you a quick overview about what is China's new economy and how do you reconcile the pessimistic view and the optimistic view of Chinese economy. If you look at this chart, you will see that new economy sounds romantic, sounds attractive, sounds competitive. However, it's called new. It means that it's still a small proportion in the national GDP, right? Before it grows to big enough, its contribution to the GDP growth is still moderate, still little. China is still an early beginner at the new industries. And actually, everyone is the early beginner for AI, right? But the Chinese government tried to use this new industry to boost up the quality of growth. So that's why I say there is a change of growth paradigm in China. It's not anymore labor-intensive growth. It's not anymore investment-driven growth. It's not anymore pollution-driven growth. It's more driven by tech. So still, the old economy still accounts for a significant proportion of GDP growth. And if you look at exports, the new three is still a small proportion for China's trade surplus. The majority is still what? The traditional exports. It takes time for Chinese economy to really upgrade. But one thing I have to remind you, one thing is about in China, the current new industry have a relatively limited capacity to absorb labor force. When you talk about shoe industry, they can absorb labor force of all ages. 20, 30, 40, 50, you can all work in the factory of shoes. However, for AI, for the chip industry, it usually only attract for premium student from the university graduate from premium universities. So new industry have relatively limited capacity of absorbing labor force. That is a big challenge for the Chinese government in terms of employment. Right? So this is something I would like to share with you. And of course, I share with you one of the reading talking about the policy that's shaping China's industrial landscape in 2025 this year. So I think this is, you can go through that. But one thing I would like to share with you that early this year, since September 2024, Chinese government make a substantial change of their macroeconomic policy. They start to step into a more aggressive macroeconomic policy regarding fiscal policy, regarding the monetary policy, regarding to investment and consumptions to try to boost up the economy. And there is also, in terms of external economic policy, China start to expand their market access through foreign investment and industrial catalogs. So almost 4 or 5 years ago, if you look at foreign investment negative list, there's a whole long list. Many of the sectors or activities is not allowed for foreign investment. But now this number has shrunk to only 29 fields, very little. So in other words, Chinese economy become more and more open to the foreign investment. And this way, I guess the Trump tariff could even push China's door even wider open, right? To be more attractive to the international investors, China tried to open more areas for global investors. And for China actually launched a new catalog called Foreign Investment Encouraged Catalog. It's not anymore you are allowed or not into this industry. If you come to industry, we give you subsidy or give you preferential treatment. And it's called, there are two types of catalog called national catalog and regional catalog. So national catalog implemented by the central government, regional catalog depending on different provincial arrangements. And of course, green industry catalog is always popular in China. And advancing emerging industry, these are two areas, and Chinese government provides substantial support for foreign investors. And one thing I would like to share with you, I guess many of the Latin American countries, they have very strong competitiveness regarding to agriculture industries, commodity industries. So recently, I think last 2024, China started to advocate for rural revitalization. They try to boost up their rural areas or agricultural sector even more. Remember, one of the areas that made in 2025 didn't succeed very well is agricultural machinery. That's why the Chinese government tried to push more on that direction. Well, I do recommend you to read the last readings. I recommend readings to see more detailed description about the Chinese policies. So it seems that the opposing views about Chinese economy can be well reconciled through a word called industrial upgrading. Through the industrial upgrading, you will see the traditional sector witness declining. Like Chinese government intentionally pricked the bubble in the real estate sector to slow down the housing price boom and to squeeze the resources, investment funds to the new industries, to the new emerging industries like EV, like solar panel, to boost up this transition. However, the process is painful for many people, right? Especially if you own a house, if you own multiple houses with mortgage, the house value going down by 30%. You don't feel very well, right? So this is one of the obvious facts. Is Quail, you raise a hand?
Yes, thank you, Professor. I'd like to raise a question, if I may. I read a decade ago in a book that a significant portion of the Chinese soil is useless for farming due to drought and other weather conditions. Do you have any data in terms of improvement or working through technology to reverse this situation? Thank you.
This is a very, very good question. Actually, this is one of the areas Chinese Chinese government as well as companies, they are devote huge amount of resources, try to clean up their soil, which has been heavily polluted during the early stage of industrialization in the 1990s, early 2000s. So, however, it takes time. And one news I heard about is, the rubbish that from daily life has caused significant trouble for major cities in China. Many of the places out in the suburban areas of China, the rubbish are created by the city center, and people cannot recycle that, cannot follow the particular protocol 30 years ago. They just bury that. That caused significant damage to the underwater, to the ecosystem around the city areas. But now what Chinese government do or Chinese firm do, they actually come up with a novel technology to clean up this rubbish, to burn that, create that into electricity and clean up this waste gas. So now, I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not. There are people joking that we don't have rubbish anymore to burn. They all burn rubbish produced at the contemporary years. They try to dig out the rubbish, the buried in the suburban area 20 years ago. They already run out of the rubbish, so they have to dig out the old rubbish. So I think that's one of the things, to burn rubbish to create electricity, to create heat, and clean up the waste gas. So therefore, they can reconcile this kind of the side effects of early stage of industrialization. I think this is also some of the technology could be shared with emerging economies, which are currently going through this industrialization process. All right, thank you so much for the question. Now, last part, I would like to give you maybe 5 minutes, a quick overview about the current geoeconomic tension and how the U.S. and China, how China respond to the geoeconomic tension in the last 6 years. I would say last 6 years since 2018. So this chart shows you the U.S. top trade partners as percent of U.S. imports from 2017 to 2024. So why I choose 2017? Because Trump first round of U.S.-China trade war started in 2018, right? We take 2017 as a benchmark year and look at what happened after 7 years. So you will see clearly China accounts for roughly 22% of U.S. imports in 2017. And after 7 years, China only accounts for 13%. So China has witnessed a decline in the U.S. Imports about 8 percentage points. That's a huge, right? Huge drop. So of course, U.S. purchased more from European Union, from Mexico, from Canada, and also from emerging Asia economies, from Vietnam, from Taiwan, from India. This is clearly U.S. is de-risking or decoupling with China to some degree. And how about China? Doing very much the same as the U.S. If you look at in 2017, U.S. is the primary destination for Chinese exports. However, in 2024, U.S. share in Chinese export fell by 4 percentage points. How about European Union? Also, European Union share in China's total trade fell by 2.2 percentage points. In 2017, European Union was the #1 trade partners, US was the second, and ASEAN was the number third. Now about 7 years later, ASEAN became the first trade partner, largest trade partner of China. And it gains by 4% and 22.5 percentage point in terms of export and imports. And interestingly, that Latin America and the Caribbean country become the fourth largest trade partner of China in 2024. And if you look at among the 4 trading partners, you will see clearly that Latin America country is the only major trade partner that China had run trade deficit. China has import more from Latin American country than export to the Latin American country. So if you look at the 7 years, Latin American countries' share in China's imports rose by 2.4 percentage points. So China shift previous demand from US in terms of soybean, in terms of agricultural produce, to Brazil, to Argentina, right? The trade diversion effect through the Trump's trade war 1.0. And people already report that since this April, the US new tariff, China has diverted even more demand from US soybean to Brazil soybean. So we expect to see even higher increase of Latin American country share in China's imports. And how China do this? So if you heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, you probably know that this is one of the major plan China tried to, what we call going south. China is not anymore putting US or European Union as a major trade partner. They are going for ASEAN, going for Latin America. So that's called going south, so global south. And as of last month, BRI cover almost 150 countries. Not all countries are active these days, but this is roughly 150 countries signed a memorandum of understanding with China regarding Belt and Road Initiative. And in 2024, BRI country account for 47% of China's export and 54% of imports. So clearly, China has taken a going south strategy. try to de-risk from the US, the same way as US de-risk from China. And there's recently people talk about Belt and Road Initiative 2.0 or rebooted. It's basically Chinese, in the first round of BRI, Chinese government play a major role in facilitating these projects. This project was usually financed by Policy Bank in China and supported by official aid. In the recent round, after pandemic, China tried to take a different approach. They talk about small and beautiful. They don't engage too much on the grand projects. They are going green and digital, and small project and try to be more market based. And the commercial banks become major player in supporting these projects. And one of the projects you probably heard about is Peru's Changi Port, launched last year during the APEC meetings. So Changi Port was one of the major project on the Belt and Road Initiative that is 80 kilometers north of Lima and a major hub port of China-South America trade. It's not only serving for Peru, it's serving for South America. This is one of the largest container ports in the world. And it was previously when Latin America or Peru or Brazil want to ship goods to China, they could either go to Mexico or go to Long Beach in California and then ship to the China or in Asian market. But after the launch of this port, there will be new routes. There will be roughly 10 or 20 days early. I mean, the travel distance will be 10 or 20 days less than previously go through Mexico or United States. And given the current geoeconomic tension between China and US, probably safer to go directly from Peru to China rather than stop over in the US, right? So yeah, another one of the important project that announced, people talk about, it is not, people talk about last month was the new bio-oceanic corridor from the Atlantic side of Brazil to Changi Port. This is the 3,000 miles grand plan of connecting these two oceans. And this one is expected to further boost up the Latin America trade with China, with Asia. So this is the grand project. Of course, it's too early to say how successful it could be, but it's another plan that, thanks to the opening of the Changi Port, that will give this project revitalize this project, make it more feasible to implement. Of course, maybe we'll need to wait for another 5 years to assess how successful this project would be, right? But I will give you a few things. It will also cut the shipping. If you traditionally from here to Asia, you have to go to the south or to Africa and then go to Asia. It takes 10 days more. But with this new routes, it will also cut travel days by 10 days. So these are the plans that could create more opportunity for Latin America to be more closely connected, not to China, but to Asia in general. Remember, ASEAN economy was also growing very fast. And if these routes, also this grand infrastructure is in place, it could facilitate trade between Latin America country with ASEAN economy, including Southeast Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, and many of the many of the economy in the region. Another one I would like to share you briefly is about Digital Silk Road. Digital Silk Road is about the digital connection. China has launched this plan many years ago, but during COVID, it's almost stalled. But now people talk about this plan again, partially because of the so-called the AI, the new algorithm. Early this year, you probably heard about DeepSeek. So this is DeepSeek is a new software. It's not a chip. It's not hardware. It's a software. It's an algorithm. It's a large language model that utilize inferior chip that produce almost the same quality of output as the large language model using advanced chip. So in other words, you could generate the high quality outcome either by relying on high hardware or rely on the algorithm-based software. So the innovation of open source DeepSeek large language model offers a new opportunity for emerging economy, not anymore rely too much on expensive high-end chips, but use average quality chips could also achieve the same goal. So this is something that this new approach offer a parallel approach, parallel with high-end chip. You can go through high-end algorithm. So this could offer emerging economy a second option to build up their own digital infrastructure. And the digital Silk Road will facilitate this through building the connecting emerging economy through this cable network and to share the computing power. However, international observers will always talk about data security, data sovereignty, and also how to address privacy concerns. So because a lot of international observers talking about data sovereignty issues these days, because data is the oil, right? So you don't want to share data easily with the third country if you don't get properly remunerated. All right. So in the end, I would briefly talk about the opportunities for Latin American and Caribbean countries. Besides the traditional funding opportunities through the Belt Road Initiative, you could also see that China will have a even higher demand for food and natural resources in the coming years, because China is going not anymore from manufacturing, average manufacturing, they're going to high-end manufacturing. And the rare earth element will be in high demand in China. And if you look at many of the Latin American countries, they have huge deposits of rare earth elements that create opportunity for Asia or for China to work together to explore these opportunities. And people also talk about to utilize Chinese technology to build a factory in Latin American country to refine these rare earth elements in Latin American country to leave the value added in Latin American country, rather than ship only the raw material to Asia, to China for refinery. So this could be also a new opportunity for Latin American country to work closely with China and try to create more value added and for local labor for local job market. And another one is about e-commerce, which is also a popular topic these days. So I did have an opportunity to visit Peking universities for 2 months last year. I did have first-hand experience about what is digital economy in China. So during my 2 months time in Peking, I didn't even step a foot into a shop. I spent 2 months in China, use my smartphone to order everything. Everything delivered to my doorstep. I don't even go shopping anymore. So you can see how much the digital infrastructure in China has been developed, especially in Beijing. Probably Beijing is one of the most developed digital infrastructure in China. But still, a lot of options, a lot of solutions have been tested, experimented, and applied for business users. I think this could also offer a new opportunity for metropolitan areas in Latin American countries to leverage upon this digital technology to create more value added, create more jobs. So one of the major booming industries in China is service industry called delivery. In my apartment, I live in the residential building with 30 floors, and every floor have something like 20 apartments. So when I get out of my apartment in the morning, I see a lot of boxes stacked on the footstep. They're all delivery box. When I came back to my apartment, I see another piles of paper box in front of every door. So people don't go shopping anymore. People go shopping online. So this is interesting. I wouldn't call this is a good option, but that will be an option for many of the people. So I think this is a digital economy could create a lot of jobs, even for the people who temporarily laid off. They could serve as a delivery. And this delivery is not about delivery through 10 kilometers, actually delivery within the residential area, because the package will deliver to the residential area. The staff will only pick up the product, the package from one building and send to another building. So that will create a lot of jobs for middle-aged people who temporarily get laid off due to economic recession in China. So in other words, this is a service industry. The digital economy will create new jobs, I would say. So anyway, that's what I could share with you about it's only a very short time. We can only give you a snapshot about what Chinese digital economy, Chinese new economy, and how to reconcile the different views about Chinese economy in general. I think I will stop here, given the time limit. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Haiping. That was very informative. I learned a lot from that. And so let's thank Haiping now, and we'll have a 10-minute break. Your next session will be at 10:40 with Associate Professor Stephen Noakes. Thanks again, Haiping.
Yep. Thank you.
Now,
Yeah.
just switch on the recording. Good afternoon to all of you. Almost evening now for most of you. We're back, and we had a very informative, information-packed session with Haiping earlier on the trade and economy of China. So now we'll go into the politics side of it, and we have our next speaker, our lecturer for the second part of your session today. He is an associate professor at our Politics and International Relations Department. And our connection is that he's actually my master's and thesis supervisor together with Jennifer. So without further ado, he'll be giving more information about himself. So I'll leave him to do it. But I'll hand you over to Associate Professor Stephen Noakes. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much. Kia ora, everyone. Good to meet you in this way. I understand it's almost evening there. It is mid-morning for me. It is great to be here with you. I understand that Gay is going to just be monitoring the chat while I'm talking. It's actually quite hard to toggle back and forth to see the chat while a person is presenting, even with two monitors. Just so I know whom it is that's out there, I'm wondering if you could give me a quick rundown, Gay, or just enter in the chat there and have Gay summarize it. Where are people based physically right now? Various points of origin, I imagine. Do we have a solid sense of where people are zooming in from?
Yep, they're from all over Latin America.
Yeah.
So we have people from
Yeah.
Brazil, Mexico, so various parts, and of course, Caribbean as well. So yeah, they're from all over Latin America.
All right, good to know. It's funny, you prepare these talks and you go into them with a sense that the issues that I present when I do these talks, regardless of where people are zooming in from or the region in question, are going to be different and yet the same. These are issues pertaining to the geopolitics of China's rise. Without wanting to second guess the experiences or views that are out there, my bet at this stage, my hunch, is that you will probably be thinking about China's rise in much the same way as previous groups I've spoken to from Southeast Asia and Latin America. There is a certain global sameness, if you like, to a lot of the issues and the impressions of China's rise that I observe when I do these talks. And so I'm thinking that in some ways that will likely be the case here too, though of course local experience is bound to vary a little bit. I've given the talk the title of Understanding Global China with a subtitle then Challenging Misperceptions, because there's quite a lot of these out there. In my job, I hear strange things said about China all the time, and it's not necessarily always done with malice. It's done because the level of understanding and knowledge about what China is around the world is not always particularly high. We know, for example, that China knowledge is not high in New Zealand. And in those environments, people tend to fall back on what they think China is. And so in some respects, it's a good thing to pause and reflect on China's rise and maybe come away with it with a slightly different impression of what it is, or more accurately, I suppose, why it does the things it does. It can put new light on China's engagement as it's experienced in various points around the world. This is me. If you're wondering why I talk like this, it's because I'm originally from a small to medium-size-ish town in southwestern Ontario, Canada. I've lived in New Zealand for about 12 years. But I'm originally from a place called Brantford. If you could see the little map there, I don't know if this would necessarily make any sense to anyone out there. There's no earthly reason why you would know where this was, but it's about an hour drive west of Toronto, near Hamilton and London, Ontario. I'm from Brantford, which is just sort of in the bottom left-hand side of that little map. The house I grew up in is the one my dad built in that town. It is maybe about 45 minutes drive to Buffalo, New York, or to Niagara Falls. So I've grown up in quite close proximity to the United States. All my degrees are Canadian, though for my doctoral degree, I spent time at Fudan University, which is in Shanghai. Once my PhD was complete, I was a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and since that time, I've held visiting fellowships at a range of Chinese universities as well. As I said, I've been here for 12 years in Auckland. I took a position teaching Chinese politics and foreign policy, arriving here in June of 2013. I did not grow up in a situation, though, where I was exposed to a lot of China knowledge at home. My parents are not diplomats or missionaries or anything like that. And so I didn't really acquire the China knowledge I came to have until well into my adult years. I didn't speak, read, or write any Chinese until I was way into my 20s. And even now, that is an ongoing struggle. Perhaps it's different. I imagine it to be different for people who learn Chinese as a child, but I didn't. And so that kind of thing is an ongoing struggle. If there are others out there who might be, for whatever reason, in whatever capacity, learning Chinese, you know how difficult a thing that is. It's going to be a lifelong process of having to continually refresh and upkeep those skills. And it is for me as well. I mention this not to demonstrate how cool I am, but because I can't be anyone other than myself. And so the information that I'm presenting to you, I just want people to be aware of where I come from in the world, how my experience may be different from yours. And just because I say a thing doesn't make it true. If you ask two different academics the same question, you're likely as not to get two different answers, and more still if you continue asking greater numbers of academics. So this is just my take. And as I say, it's quite normal in my job to encounter people who have at once strong views about China, but admit they have relatively thin knowledge of it. And so part of my role, I think, in these talks and elsewhere is to see if we can bring those two things somehow closer together. As I mentioned, the level of China knowledge in New Zealand among the general public is not high. My experience giving these talks and asking this question of audiences is that is a very, very common thing. If there are people out in the audience there from Colombia, from Brazil, from Argentina, from Trinidad, from whichever port of call, my sense is that it's probably the case, and maybe I'm wrong, I'd be happy to be corrected actually, that the level of China knowledge among the general public is not high. It's the case here in New Zealand too, and I've pulled some figures from the most recent public surveys we have about this in our context here in the South Pacific. Not that many people claim to know a fair amount about Asia or China, but what we do know from the survey research that's been done is that when New Zealanders hear the word Asia, they think of China first. That might be a little bit different to your experiences, but possibly not. It's just that it's something cognitive that happens for Kiwis. You say the word Asia, China is where their mind goes, and there are good reasons for that. China is at once New Zealand's largest trading partner. I imagine it to be quite high on the list of trading partners, if not the leading one in many of your cases as well. But it's also a place that New Zealanders view as being Gay, I'm having trouble seeing my slides. Is everybody seeing them okay?
Yep. So you just got back to your previous slide. So just
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So if it moves ahead though, you should be
Yeah.
seeing a red one right now. Can you all see that?
Can you try and move it maybe? Yeah. So
There you go, red and blue.
the charts.
Okay,
Yeah.
there we are.
Okay.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. In New Zealand, to pick up where I left off, folks are not sure how to feel about China, even though that's where their minds go when they hear the word Asia. On the one hand, New Zealand is quite dependent economically on China's rise and what it has to offer. On the other hand, it's very wary about what greater engagement with China could portend for all sorts of things, ranging from proprietary technologies, personal safety in the case of possibly some diaspora Chinese groups or organizations. Foreign interference is not quite top of mind here in the way it is in North America, but it is something that's being discussed, and the word China figures prominently in those conversations. You can see from the data that I've got up there, New Zealanders are not quite sure how to feel, and I imagine this to be the case in many of your home countries as well. Which countries are friends to New Zealand? Well, Japan and Singapore top that list. China is, as you can see, way, way down that list. Which countries are threats to New Zealand? Well, Japan and Singapore are barely perceived as threats at all, but there's China, far and away the biggest threat. So imagine this context. Which countries are friends to New Zealand? Which countries are threats to New Zealand? Imagine being in a situation where you are at once commercially and economically dependent on a place, and at the same time, view that same place as possibly your biggest threat. What a weird state of affairs that actually is. Probably no surprise here. Of all the things I've shown you so far, I imagine this likely rings true for a lot of you as well. Which Asian country has the greatest influence over New Zealand currently? It's China far and away. There is not really any doubt. Overwhelmingly, folks are saying, yeah, for good or ill, China is present. So what are we to make of this bizarre confluence of opinions we have, positive and negative, about China? Leading me, therefore, to a bigger question, a conceptual question that I want you to bear in mind as we go through this over the next hour or so together. What do we imagine China to be? What exactly do we think China is? In a little while, I'm going to ask folks in the breakout rooms to consider this question a little bit. But for the moment, I'll preface it all by saying this. We often approach China with a great deal of confirmation bias. We reflect in China what we think it is rather than what it in fact is. I meet people all the time who express surprise that things don't happen in China the way they're used to seeing them happen. And it's nearly always the case, particularly in places like New Zealand or Canada, that people approach China expecting to view things or expecting to see outcomes that would be typical in a consolidated liberal democracy. But China was not designed that way. It doesn't function that way. In an environment where economic dependence combines with threat perception and knowledge of the dependence and threat remain low, there is, I think, a very human tendency to just fall back on what we know or think we know, what we believe to be true. People default to that. I say that not with a sense that people are doing it maliciously. It's a very, very human thing. We map our own experiences onto this cultural other, and that comes with some inherent dangers. So when I was putting this presentation together, I emptied my head of some of the more common impressions of China that I encounter in my work or that I hear in my day-to-day life. Maybe wave your hands or put something in the chat if these ring true for you in any respect? First of all, China is sometimes thought to be very monolithic. That is to say, it thinks and functions as one. We use the word China without necessarily a great deal of recognition of its internal variegation and diversity. Sometimes I meet people who are extremely surprised to find that there's politics in China at all. The impression they have is that it's under the thumb of a dictator, one guy, one party, and therefore thinks and acts and behaves all as one. It's not so. Second, this one's might be my favorite actually, that China is stable and orderly and well institutionalized. If your main experience of China is of the Bund in Shanghai, or what you can see in the picture on the right there, Pudong New Area in Shanghai, I can see why you would think that China was stable and orderly and well institutionalized. It's squeaky clean when you visit. Things seem to function in a very orderly and well manner. In some respects, it makes Manhattan seem passé. So I do understand where that impression comes from, but Pudong New Area, as you see in the picture there, isn't really China any more than Manhattan is America. It's a part of it, of course, and an important part of it, but the experience of China, the definition of China is actually quite a bit broader, and I think you might find the deeper you dig into it, it's quite a bit more chaotic. And things happen at a much lower level of development than they're often imagined to occur. I've listed both adaptive and developed there. To this point, people often believe that China is a rising world power, economically and otherwise. When we talk about China as an emergent economic superpower, that carries a connotation of China's catching up to the United States. I often hear people talk about this, or a sense somehow that China is taking over this or that it is, and it's true, it is increasing, it's exercising increasing influence over the global economy. But what is not said often enough, and I will elaborate on this as the talk goes on, is that China is very much a developing country and has really all of the attributes that you would associate with words like developing country. It's not necessarily the case that it is catching up to the United States, or indeed most developed countries at all, at least not yet. Finally, I put that last one there because I was thinking about my mom when I put the talk together. I think a lot of people, ordinary folks in places like New Zealand and Canada, and I'm guessing across Latin America as well, have this impression of China as brutal and threatening. For people of a certain age, they probably came to that opinion because at a moment in the late 1980s when communist regimes were convulsing and collapsing around the world, everyone was shown grainy video of a lone protester staring down a column of tanks. People are well acquainted with human rights situations of various types in China. They have been for many decades. And then when you see a photograph such as the one of the tank man from Tiananmen Square, for a lot of people, I think, across the world, that really reinforced the perceptions they already had of what a communist regime actually was. The thing is, that was a long time ago now. 35 years in the lifespan of modern China is almost an eternity. The Chinese Communist Party bears many of the markers of its ideological and structural heritage, no doubt about that. But it's also proven extremely adaptive, much more adaptive than we, I think, have really given it proper credit for. And so my take is that the more we examine China on its own terms, the less threatening it appears, but also the less stable and orderly it appears. This too has implications for how we think about Chinese foreign policy in our various locales around the world. Folks out there are probably familiar in one way, shape, or form with the Belt and Road Initiative, the flagship Chinese foreign policy under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Are people feeling threatened by BRI? Well, the answer to that usually depends on the various preconceived notions people have about what China is, about the rationale underpinning its foreign policy. It might be a little bit more complicated than is often discussed, certainly in the English or Spanish speaking or Portuguese speaking parts of the world. What exactly is a party state? I should be careful here because, in my line of work, I rattle off terminology. Sometimes in a fairly careless fashion, we use certain terms interchangeably. It has a very specific meaning, though. And this is important because Marxist-Leninist party states, like China's, used to comprise half the globe. If I was giving this talk in 1985, there would be many, many more states like China on the map. In my line of work, we often say that there are now only 5 nominally communist states left in the world, Marxist-Leninist party states. It's probably not an accident that 4 of them share a contiguous border. So the 5 would be China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba is the only one left in the Western Hemisphere. Of those, only North Korea really resembles what it did decades ago. The others have undertaken significant and ongoing reform. A party state, as I talk about it here, is really a regime, by which I mean a set of institutions, in which a single party monopolizes politics and bans other parties or excludes them from power. That's what China's political system was designed to do at its inception. Okay? These kinds of party-based dictatorships are just one type of authoritarian regime or semi-authoritarian regime. It would be a larger category, though, that also includes other forms of non-democratic regimes, things like military dictatorships or absolutist monarchies, and many other forms as well. The Chinese party state is a subspecies of what I'm going to describe for you here as the party state genus, based on the Marxist-Leninist framework and modeled after the Soviet example from a century ago. There are other places in the world that have party states, but are not communist or Marxist-Leninist in their orientation. The paragon example would be something like Singapore. As I mentioned, it is common and very normal and extremely human to unconsciously apply our mental frames and expectations based on experiences of politics with liberal democracy, if you're in New Zealand, or with however politics is practiced in your home locale. But to do that, wherever it is you're based, whatever your frame of reference is to miss much of the reality of what China is today. When we speak of China today, we often employ a framework, a somewhat old framework now. It's stood for a long time, known as fragmented authoritarianism. Right? We have this notion that China is highly centralized. Words like centrally planned economy were used to describe the way China functioned for so long, as was the case in other Marxist-Leninist states. It is implied that China thinks and acts as one. It is not true. Why? Fragmented authoritarianism. There's a classic Chinese saying, and I'm just giving you the English translation here. What the center mandates, the local finds a way to ignore. Right? At various levels of public policymaking and public administration, China has long experienced a problem with the center of government executing its policy preferences at lower levels of administration. It's an ongoing problem and a widely acknowledged one, not just in the West either. This is something that is acknowledged in China itself. Xi Jinping sometimes refers to subordinates at lower levels of policymaking as two-faced men. What he actually means is that if his wishes are not executed in the way he wants to see them done, it's because of people who double-crossed him, people who said one thing and did another, who weren't committed to the cause, things like that. How else is this affected? Well, again, the Chinese Communist Party is sometimes imagined to be monolithic, right? But that's not true. Intra-party factionalism was and still is a significant feature of the system. Like all political parties everywhere, China's Communist Party contains wings. It contains factions. Historically, it has brought together people who hate each other and have tried to murder each other, sometimes successfully. There is a history of that in the Chinese context. At the moment, the key faction within the party exists between what we refer to as the princelings, and I don't even think the other faction has a name. It would just be the non-princelings, I suppose. The princelings versus everybody else. A princeling, when referring to factions in the Chinese Communist Party, are people who got their positions of power because of who their parents were, right? If this was Hollywood, we would call them Nepo babies or something like that. Nepotism, right? Xi Jinping is part of that princeling faction. There are other prominent folks in Chinese politics who have their position because of who their dad was. Parenthetically, I'll add that it is in virtually all cases a matter of who their dad was. Women do not access, historically or currently, very often the upper echelons of Communist Party power. There are other elements that intersect with parentage to make the princelings what they are as a faction. One of these would be where you went to school, right? So if you were to look at the intellectual background of people at the upper echelons of the Communist Party, what you would find is that they attended one of a handful of elite Chinese universities, often Tsinghua or Beida, sometimes Fudan. In nearly all cases, they studied STEM degrees, some type of science or engineering degree, computers, what have you, is quite common as well. This is just to say how it is right now. People who are not a part of the princeling faction, who didn't get their jobs because of family connections, would have come up in other ways. The more conventional means would be paying your dues in an organization, a party-based organization like the Communist Youth League or the Young Pioneers or something like that. In the past, there have been other factions. A long-standing one is known as the Shanghai Clique. And it began in the 1990s with the rise of the third generation leadership of Jiang Zemin after the Tiananmen Square incident. And the Shanghai Clique is the one known for most favoring economic restructuring and aggressive economic growth, similar in style, in a way, to the policies of, say, Margaret Thatcher in Britain or Ronald Reagan in the United States. There was, in the early 1980s, an oil faction within the party that drilled something like 8 million square miles and found not a drop. And the oil faction was then never heard from again. All this is to say the Communist Party is not exactly what you think it is. What it actually is a Rolodex. If people don't know what a Rolodex is, it's a contact list, in effect. It's a means for people to connect with each other. People go into politics in China for the same reason they go into party politics anywhere, for the connections. There's wide variance in the performance of the local and central states in China. This too goes to the disjointedness or fragmented nature of the system that makes it more chaotic than it often seems to outsiders. The central state in China is actually quite capable. It's powerful, it's resourceful. The local state is not. Not at all. And why this matters is because the local state, as you might know where you live, for example, or where I live, that's where most of the governing that most people care about actually happens. Right? Whatever might be going on in the capital can be miles, possibly hundreds or even thousands of miles away. But you might feel especially angry about your trash service if it's not very good. Right? It's the local state in China that is actually far more corrupt, generally speaking, than the central state, and has a great deal of difficulty with basic functionality. Where people in China have negative perceptions of their governments, it's local governments they're mostly talking about. Within that system, we're able to see greater pluralization or the emergence of opportunities for policy entrepreneurs to become active within different layers of government. There are more participatory avenues in China for policymaking than people imagine there are. There's actually a great deal of policy experimentation at the local level. There are specifically designated places that are treated almost as laboratories for the viability of policy of various kinds. I wanted to just underscore once more, though, that this really is often not what people think of when they think about China. You don't think of it as an open participatory place. You don't think of a place where people consult, where their government consults. You think of it as a place where their government dictates. That's not entirely true. And China hasn't been that for 40 years now. Would you be surprised to learn that there is now 45 years worth of history of conducting local elections in China? The very first ones began in July of 1980. I frequently meet people who are shocked to learn that local elections are indeed a feature of the system. There have been millions of them conducted to date. They aren't necessarily open, free, or fair elections. We know who's going to win, but they are elections nevertheless. It's also a significantly more consultative political system than it's given credit for. Before I move on, I want to go to this last point here. It's incredibly chaotic, and the rules of the game seem to matter, except for when they don't. Right? This is what I meant when I said, in some respects, China bears some of the hallmarks of developing countries. The rules matter, except for when they don't. You find inconsistencies much more than you expect to once you can come to understand the structure and the nature of policymaking in China. All of that gives it a very high degree of unpredictability. So if in the conduct of your jobs, for example, you have meetings with Chinese counterparts and you have to deal with them, this could pertain to you. You might be apprehensive about sharing certain pieces of information with them. And it's possible that those fears are unfounded. But because of the extraordinarily unpredictable and opaque nature of this system, you'll never really know where the information goes. For example, let me give you an example from my own work. Were I doing my job as an academic at a mainland Chinese university, or were I to visit a department at a mainland Chinese university, it would be someone's duty there as a party affairs liaison to fill out a piece of paper. Say once a month, they have a meeting, and they would have to outline who was teaching what this semester, who was researching what this semester? Did you welcome any foreign guests? Who were they? Where do they work? Why were they here? What did they speak about? Was a public talk held? Did they meet with any students? Who sponsored their applications? Things like that. You may know, being policy folks yourselves, that some people are real sticklers for paperwork, and they care a great deal about what happens on those forms. But other people, they don't really care at all. The form might be filled out, it might not be filled out. And China's the same, because of this inherently unstable, chaotic, unpredictable, and often unobservable nature of the system we're talking about, you will never really know what you're walking into. You can't really be sure. So my advice to people when I give these talks, and I do this sort of a lot, is to behave as though everybody already knows everything. Assume that it's plausible the information you give them is going to be seen by somebody else further up the chain in some other capacity. There aren't the prohibitions on privacy or information sharing restrictions that we might find in other places or that you might be accustomed to. So I guess what I'm really saying is exercise your best judgment, knowing that you'll probably never know where the information actually ends up or whom it might ultimately be seen by. How am I doing on time there, Gay? I have about 11:15.
Yeah, it's 11:16. So you have some
Cool.
time.
Okay. All right. I'll move a little bit quickly, but just to put a bit more meat on the bones there for you. The problem of intra-party factionalism is one we need to consider when we think about meeting with Chinese counterparts or thinking about China's role in the world more generally, because it affects succession politics within the party. So unlike other places where you might expect to have a primary process to determine who the leadership is, and there's some sort of public working out of the changing of the guard, so to speak, that doesn't really happen. Rather, the Chinese system is based almost entirely on what we might call patron-client relations, or in the Chinese context, guanxi. Guanxi is related to, or in the Western world, we'd probably say networking or something like that. However, guanxi in the Chinese context does sometimes carry a connotation of swapping favors. You do this for me and I'll do that for you. You give me this job, I'll make sure your son or daughter gets that plum job. I'll make sure your nephew is considered for that internship. I'll make sure your kid gets into that university, something like that. This means that everybody you meet who is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and there are 90 some odd million people, or roughly 1 in 20 Chinese citizens, have the role they have because they were somebody's hand-picked favorite. One must be a protege of someone else. It's the only way to advance because there are no other public open processes. There are no primaries to get ahead, right? Everybody has the job they have because they were the favorite of somebody else. This creates, or at least opens the door for, enormous corruption problems, right? The reason we hear so much about the anti-corruption campaign in China isn't because it's not a problem, but because it's a massive problem that unless it is dealt with and is not any longer a feature of normal everyday political life, it can and it will undermine public confidence in the Communist Party. That's why it's being addressed. It's acknowledged to be a serious problem. It has definite political consequences. As part of that campaign, Xi is interested in catching what he refers to as tigers and flies. In other words, both large-scale graft, headline-grabbing graft, as well as relatively slow dollar, comparatively insignificant things that might happen at the level of, say, everyday bureaucracy. So an example of the latter, flies, would be something like police officers accepting under-the-table protection money for a local business. That is more common than you think. It's not something people necessarily always imagine to be a feature of everyday life in China, but it is. It would be low-level bribes given to everyday officials in some capacity. The fight against tigers in corruption, though, really is about demonstrating for the Chinese public how seriously the Communist Party takes the problem of corruption and how interested it is in making an example, where it has to, of the greatest offenders. The person with their head turned in the picture on the bottom right there is Zhou Yankang. And several years ago, Zhou Yankang was put away for life on corruption charges. This person had, up to that point, been the state security czar. An equivalent thing would be like the director of the FBI or the CIA director in the United States being given life in prison. The person on the top is Bo Xilai, disgraced Bo Xilai, who about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe a little more actually, ceased to be the flamboyant head of the party in Chongqing, and also is, I would say, lucky to have his life. Many of these tigers managed to get life sentences, but only after a lengthy appeals and clemency process commutes the executions that were originally thought to be put in place. What does corruption in this system actually look like? By far, the most common thing is embezzlement. The misappropriation of public funds, but that extends also to improper spending, where people have charge over a budget. So a few years back, for example, there were new laws passed, regulations on what could be served at official banquets and state dinners and the like. It used to be the case, for example, that those functions were to be very lavish things. And so shark fin soup, I'm not sure if there are people out there familiar with this, but it's a special kind of soup usually served at moments of occasion. Weddings, for example, traditionally, this kind of thing is served in China. Shark fin soup can no longer be served at official banquets and state dinners because it's too extravagant. The expense is too high, and it creates the wrong impression for the Chinese public about what exactly a state dinner is supposed to be about. The similar prohibitions now exist on alcohol and cigarettes. It used to be totally normal, not very long ago, for tobacco to be provided as part of these meals. It no longer can be. Those also now fall under corruption. Bribery or influence peddling of one sort or another is quite common. Within that, what you also find to be quite common is state collusion with organized crime. Often, where this happens, it's semi-rural settings or smaller to mid-sized cities where they have difficulty recruiting police officers because the job doesn't pay very much. And it's difficult to live on a police officer's salary. It'd be really hard to raise a family on that. And so what tends to happen in some of these places that are thinly policed is local authorities end up paying protection, extra legal protection, to organized crime outfits. Sometimes that involves or overlaps with organized crime's involvement in the counterfeiting of currency, provision of kickbacks from legal or semi-legal businesses. This tends to happen in places where casino gambling is very big. And occasionally also, as part of the larger scheme, some type of money laundering. That's what the map of corruption tends to look like in China. There are certain areas of the country that are a bit more prone to it than others, as you can see. It tends to be more concentrated, though not exclusively concentrated, in hinterland, lesser developed parts of the country. Not a lot of surprise there, I wouldn't say. Who exactly is it that commits corruption in China? Overwhelmingly, it is your local town council. It's the mayor. It's the mayor's assistant or staff. It's other people who work with the town council. To a lesser degree, state-owned enterprises play a role as well. Bribery in exchange for contract or a preferential hearing. That's what I meant by influence peddling. Tends to be quite common as well. But nearly always, when this happens, it's overwhelmingly village committees that are implicated. I imagine there's people out there that think of China as an increasingly wealthy place. And that's sort of true, depending on how you look at it. It is indeed the second largest economy in the world, according to GDP by volume. However, the picture's a lot more complicated than that. The World Bank now classifies China as a middle-income country. That means China has ceased to be a lower-income country by the World Bank standards. Its economic peers are no longer places like Botswana or Namibia. Its economic peers are places like Egypt. But I don't know anyone, and I've never met anyone who thinks of Egypt as a rising global economic power, right? It is 99th overall on the purchasing power scale. Moreover, the wealth in China tends to be heavily concentrated along the eastern seaboard, the coastal regions, right? It's not lost on the mainland's government that the average Taiwanese household is substantially better off than the average household in Fujian province just across the Taiwan Strait. What else can we say about this map? That there is an extremely uneven distribution of wealth between urban and rural areas, prompting, therefore, a flood of urban migration. People are not doing the subsistence farming that they were even 20 years ago. Declining rural wages and that rising tertiary sector along the eastern seaboard and also within larger cities is actually driving a bit of that change too. I love this map. I love it so much because it really brings home the nature of China's uneven development. It could, depending on how you see things and depending on what your understanding and your definition of China is, it could make sense to say, yes, this is a global economic superpower, right? We have standards of living at various places along the eastern seaboard comparable to what you would find in some of the world's most developed places. Plenty of OECD countries, for example. The Pearl River Delta, just across the bay from Hong Kong, has a level of affluence similar to Australia. That area of the Bund, central Shanghai, is probably China's wealthiest area. It has a GDP roughly equivalent to what you'd find in Geneva. Right? It's extraordinarily wealthy, can compete with the world's wealthiest. As you head inland, that is less and less the case, or spottily the case. Most of us, I think, agree that Sweden and Belgium are relatively well-off places. New Zealand, which you see in the middle of the map there, relatively well-off place. But what happens when you get out west, where China's resources are not nearly as well exploited, where they're not as easy to exploit for a variety of reasons, and where the overall level of education is quite a lot lower? No one thinks of Senegal as a world power, and yet that's about where the average household is in Tibet in terms of its prosperity. I've never met anyone who thinks of Iraq as a global economic power, and yet that is a massive pocket of the Chinese hinterland. And those figures that liken affluence in Xinjiang to that of Iraq still takes into consideration very large centers with resource wealth like Urumqi and Kashgar. I'm going to skip ahead just because I want people to have a little bit more time to discuss this in a useful way. But I want to wind it up by bringing this back to say, look, in my view, there are actually two Chinas. One of these is stable and authoritarian, increasingly rich. The other is not any of that. It's extraordinarily decentralized, underdeveloped, institutionally coherent, and I dare say, hard to govern. If that wasn't true, you wouldn't actually be hearing China's political leadership talk in the way it does about the need to fight corruption, about the need to develop the rule of law. All of these things that around the world we associate with standards of good governance. I do not for a minute mean to suggest that China is a badly governed country by international standards. It's not. It's just that it's spottily governed. It's a much more complicated place than is really ever given credit for. Why does this matter for us as people who inhabit other places around the world who occasionally interact with China? Well, it makes me think that there are different ways we can think about Chinese foreign policy. Consider, for example, the Belt and Road. There are 3 different ways one might look at this, and they are all basically correct. They're not mutually exclusive. The one version you might be used to if you've encountered BRI before or in your own work would be a stock definition that goes something like this. The Belt and Road is fundamentally about connectivity. It is a global network of transportation hubs and systems designed to facilitate the flow of commerce and culture and provide people-to-people links, effectively shrinking the world and bringing us all closer together. Something like that. I think if we were to be asking official Chinese government sources about this, they would say something like, this is being done because, in the president's words, humanity is a community of common destiny. That's usually the stock line, or at least the way the stock line translates. That's not the only way you can view Belt and Road, and that's not the only thing Belt and Road is. Given what I just told you about China's economic status, the structure of its internal politics, its own development needs, we might also consider the Belt and Road as the outward-facing dimension of China's own development aspirations. It's not actually going to be possible for China to transcend its current status as a middle-income country and reach actual parity with global economic leaders on without inputs from around the world. And so, to my mind, it makes some sense to think about Belt and Road as an effort to shore that up. It's fundamentally about providing China with the resources it needs for its ongoing development. Development which, I might add, the Chinese Communist Party has openly and publicly staked its own future on. So there's a lot on the line. Failure to provide the continued development the Chinese public expects will bring political consequences. It absolutely will. And so the reason Chinese foreign policy is what it is because the party itself, China's government, the party state, needs these things to shore up its own economic performance and political legitimacy for the long term. Finally, we could also consider the Belt and Road as a brand, right? A brand. And that brand functions in some senses like any other brand, anywhere at all in the world. What do I mean by that? Well, China has these development projects ongoing in many countries, including many Latin American countries, and they often are carried out under the banner of Belt and Road Initiative. When those projects go well, they continue to be referred to as Belt and Road. But they don't always go well. When they go poorly, they're just never spoken of ever again. So that's my take on how we might think about Belt and Road. It's not that the way we think about China is necessarily always wrong. The slide I showed you at the beginning with those things that people have in their head when they think of China, it's stable, it's orderly, it's well institutionalized, it's brutal, it's well developed. That's partly true. It's certainly not wrong, but neither is it exactly right all the time. And China, at least in my mind, becomes a bit less threatening when you understand why it does the things it does. Inwardly, it is much more a basket case than the outside world thinks. And so what I wanted to do with a bit of the time we have here is I'm going to ask Gay to arrange the breakout rooms for you. And I'd like in those breakout rooms, folks to consider these questions. What are those common perceptions or beliefs about China in your home country? How has the history of your home's engagement with China actually affected those perceptions? What was the thing? Was there a turning point that made beliefs about China what they are? Finally, I wonder if we might consider the question of bipolarity. In New Zealand, this is a common topic of discussion. Do we need to choose a side? Is it necessary for non-superpowers to align with one of the other two? Or can you divide yourself somehow? Is there such a thing as a viable independent strategy in a world that looks increasingly bipolar? I'm going to ask Gay to put you in those rooms.
Can proceed. I've started recording again. So for this one, we have 4 groups. We'll start with group 4 this time. Anybody from your group? Group 4, volunteer. Okay, who has been chosen to report for group 4? Group 4 is Alejandra.
I will start speaking.
Oh, go ahead, Mariana.
I'm not
Yes.
sure I've written everything down. We didn't have any time to choose any speaker because we were talking about the specific case of Colombia that has a very close, that has always had a very close relation with the United States. And since like a month ago, their Colombia's president signed the Belt and Road Initiative. It seems United States president didn't like that attitude, and so there's been a very tight situation with Colombia, a very tense situation with Colombia, and so it's not very much like how Colombia feels about China, but what is happening, what consequences are happening after President Trump's decision to deal with the situation. On behalf of the other countries that were involved, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, everyone except Belize, I think, we all find in China a potential associate, commercial trading. The only thing that Belize noted was that there's a difficulty in diplomatic relations with China since they recognize they have a close relationship with Taiwan. About the rest, I think we all agree that we find an opportunity in the Chinese market for development and trading. I don't know
Okay.
if anyone else wants to add anything.
Okay. I think your group mates are happy with that. Steve, do you want to comment or do you want to proceed to the rest of the groups?
Let's hear from everybody. first.
Okay, cool. Group 3, that's Clarissa, Enrico, Marcia, Mezabi, and William. Your representative, please.
Yes. So we discussed about the perceptions about China in our home country. William from Peru said that, and I agreed with him. The perceptions are quite similar to what was described in New Zealanders. So you can see a bright side on the Chinese participation, although that there is a fear of the increasing Chinese capital in these countries, and the population is afraid of things that are not well known. Clarissa from El Salvador also described very well the two sides, the good, the part of the population that thinks that the Chinese investments are very important for the country, and also part of the population that does not agree so much with increasing participation of Chinese capital in the country. And considering the negotiations, we all agreed that it's very important for not choosing one side. So there is internal and external pressure for against the participation of China in economy. Some sectors of the society and some countries will make pressure against the investment of Chinese companies. But we agreed that this participation of both West and China and other countries from the global South too is very important in the developing of the economy. So I think it was more or less that.
Thank you, Enrico. Now let's go to group 2. Group 2 volunteer, that's Beatriz, Gabriel, Jessica, Jesus, Livia, Pericles, Wilmer.
Yeah, I can go. So I think in a
Yes.
nutshell, I think we had Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Chile. So I think we agree that like we don't really know China, but that's increasingly important economy in the world, and then it's also important economic partners for all of countries. Less so to Mexico. I think that's the only one that is not the one of the key import trading partner. And yes, we can see some of the perceptions change. I think in Colombia they mentioned it's the same in Brazil that before, and we still have this mentality that everything comes from China is not good quality, but it's been changing, because before we used to receive like what we saw in the first session, the industrialization, the cheap products and so on. And yeah, and I think we all agree that it's extremely important for us to keep a neutrality, but it's a challenging and difficult task for all our countries, and I don't know if it's harder, but maybe Mexico has an additional one because of being so close. I mean, there was a saying, so close to the US, and because it's hard for them to keep there.
Thank you so much, Livia. And finally, the last group, the group of Andrea. Who is your assigned person? Andrea, Elena, Ezekiel, Paula?
Well,
Last
we
Okay.
didn't discuss who would be the person who represent us, but we had Brazil, Argentina, El Salvador, Belize, and Mexico in our group. And in general, we share perspectives similar than that the colleagues also shared. But I think it's important to clarify that in Belize, they have a closer relationship with Taiwan. So they have they understand that China is a global power, but they have concerns about the authoritarian government in China. And for them, it's very important to keep this relationship closer to Taiwan.
Okay, thank you so much, Elena, and thank you so much, everybody. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you. Just thinking collectively about some of the feedback there. One thing that hits me is that is almost exactly the response that I thought there would be. And that everybody acknowledges that you're kind of caught, right, in this funny position. And that there are principled choices being made within that. In some respects, the example from Belize reminds me of what had happened when I delivered a similar talk back before Christmas to a room full of people from the South Pacific. Central America and the South Pacific really being the last bastions of support that the Republic of China has anywhere in the world. Notwithstanding that, I think, the thought that hits hardest, given the difficulty of walking a fine line, even in an era where American foreign policy is maybe less apt to be trusted than it would have been before, or is more unpredictable than it might be under other circumstances. China's going to be China, whether we sell it milk or not, whether you sell it electricity or not, whether you sell it rare earth minerals or not. There was once this attitude that, and I think we can blame Bill Clinton for this. There was once this attitude that it was so important to engage China in a global trade regime, right? The thinking was make China change from the inside out by making it follow the same global trade rules as everybody else. The hope was that somehow international norms would rub off on China in some way, and that was going to be the in that eventually led to the emergence of some Chinese Gorbachev who reformed the system in the way that the White House wanted to see it reformed, or something like that. Yeah, that was 30 years ago, and no one believes that's how it works anymore. So while we're walking these fine lines, we all acknowledge are difficult to walk, and we're in this funny position of at once trusting and fearing China, or being dependent on China. Acknowledge the potential then that China can change us a lot more easily than we're going to change China. That's not something previous generations of policy professionals necessarily gave proper shrift to. So that's my parting comment.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that. That was quite informative for everybody, and perhaps eye-opening for some. So we will now end with the closing karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wate a kia mama, te ngaka o te tinana, te wairua ki te ara, tangata koiara e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga, kia tina, huye, tai kie. Thanks again, Steve, and thanks everybody. We hope that you will have the good rest of your afternoon and evening, and we will see you again next week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank
See
you.
you. Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you.